Chapter 3. Paul didn't enjoy the next 10 working days. In the morning there was paperwork, all the admin and procedural stuff that every true hero gets some other poor bugger to do for him. There were applications in triplicate for Section 15 exemptions, incident reports, written notifications of intention to use restricted weapons in built-up areas, stores requisitions, expenses vouchers, and mileage allowance chits. Mr. Wormtoter got 95 pence a mile for his winged horse. Benny Shumway got 35 pence a mile for his dereg Suzuki Jeep, but mostly seemed to take the tube. Timesheets and invoices and credit control printouts and a whole bunch of other stuff you wouldn't find mentioned in the Norse sagas of the Mort Darther. But the mornings were better than the lunch hour, because between 1 and 2, he was either in Mr. Shumway's office being lectured or shouted at, or in the closed file store, which doubled as an assault course, firing range, and tournament lists. The experience helped Paul discover things about himself that he hadn't appreciated before. That Semtex brought him out in a rash, for example, and firing anti-tank rockets from the shoulder gave him a headache, and his fear of needles also extended to hand-and-a-half Katzenbalger broadswords. His cunning plan of deliberately doing so badly at everything that Mr. Shumway would despair of him and get him transferred to another department turned out to be a non-starter, mostly because he didn't need to pretend. Even when Mr. Shumway yelled at him so ferociously that he gave it his very best shot out of sheer terror, he was still uniformly hopeless at everything. His fuses spluttered and died. He couldn't hit a barn door at point-blank range with the .50 Barrett. He consistently failed to remember the right proportion of slaymore to water, and the only way he'd ever hurt a dragon or a griffin with a sword would be if the unfortunate creature was standing directly behind him when he lost his grip on the handle. This, unfortunately, was precisely what Mr. Shumway seemed to expect of him. "Don't worry about it," he'd sigh, as Paul's dummy hand grenade bounced off the opposite wall and landed at his feet for the 6th time in a row. "It just takes practice, that's all. Another couple of weeks and you'll be just fine." Lunchtimes, then, were bad enough, but they were a week at the seaside compared to the afternoons. In the afternoon, Paul helped Mr. Shumway with the banking. The first time had been the worst, because he'd had no idea. "Little job I'd like you to do for me," Mr. Shumway had said, poking his head around the door of Paul's office. "Won't take a minute." Of course, Paul had said, "Yes, right, of course," like the fool he was, instead of "no way" or "over my dead body," though in the event the latter would have been a very silly thing to say, because just inside the door of Mr. Shumway's office was another, smaller door. It was decorated with 6 bolts, 4 deadlocks, 2 Yale locks, and a chain you could have anchored an aircraft carrier from. Curious in itself, because the door was just standard office chipboard with an aluminium handle. Paul had noticed it the 3rd or 4th time he'd been in Mr. Shumway's office, but compared with some of the other fixtures and fittings he'd come across at 70 St. Mary Axe, it was prosaic to the point of brain damage, and he'd ignored it. This time, however, Mr. Shumway was busy with a bunch of keys that must have weighed 3 pounds. "I'll go first," he sang out cheerfully. "You follow on with that satchel on the desk there." He was referring to a shabby-looking leather case, the sort of thing just William carried his schoolbooks in. Paul picked it up. It felt as though it was empty. He asked, as Mr. Shumway shot back the 4th bolt. "What are we doing exactly?" "Just nipping to the bank," Mr. Shumway replied. "Paying in some cheques, drawing petty cash, handing in some TT forms, usual stuff." Paul nodded warily. He knew TT stood for telegraphic transfer, which was when you sent large sums of money by fax or internet or something. Why usual stuff needed 2 of them, with Mr. Shumway going first, he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Ready?" Mr. Shumway had finished with the bolts and all but one of the locks. "OK then, on 3. 1, 2, 3. He turned the key in the last of the deadlocks, grabbed the door handle and pushed outwards. He hesitated on the threshold, not letting go of the handle, as if checking to make sure that it was safe. Then he took a step forward and disappeared. Seriously unnerving stuff. Paul could distinctly see Benny Shumway vanish. Made no sense, but that was what he saw. First Mr. Shumway's left hand, then the rest of his left arm, his shoulder, then his head and torso, finally his back and right heel, and then he was gone. Bugger this, Paul thought. No way "Come on, then," called Mr. Shumway's disembodied voice. Paul shut his eyes and followed. When he opened them again, everything had gone dark. Panic flooded through him and he shuffled backwards towards where he remembered the door being.
"No,"
Mr. Shumway again, calm but urgent.
"Don't do that. You've got no way of knowing where it'll take you. It's complicated," he added. "I'll explain later. Just follow my voice, okay?"
Paul tried to say something, but his words turned into a little trembly squeak. He stuck his left foot out. It was rather like trying to take the last step off an escalator with your eyes shut. Nothing bad happened, apparently. After that, it was very slightly easier.
"Keep up,"
Mr. Shumway called back at him. Paul did his best, but each time Mr. Shumway spoke after that, his voice sounded further and further away.
"Don't look round, whatever you do," was another helpful piece of advice. "Come on, we're nearly there. Don't worry, all right? This is just something you'll have to get used to."
The lights came up gradually. First a faint grey gleam around the edges, then a glow that seeped into the darkness like ink soaking into blotting paper. Not that it helped much, because there was nothing to see, nothing to right or left, nothing up or very worrying down. Paul was a little animated cartoon figure walking across a blank grey screen. And there was someone walking beside him. He didn't notice at first, so he had no idea how long he'd been there. It was only when he glimpsed movement out of the corner of his eye.
"And don't talk to anybody,"
sighed a faint echo of Mr. Shumway's voice.
"Not anybody. Got it?"
Just in time, because Paul had been on the verge of saying, "Is that you, Uncle Mike?" He'd only hesitated because it was such a silly thing to say, given that Uncle Mike had died 10 years ago.
"Course it's me, you prat," said a memory of Uncle Mike's voice inside his head. "And look at me when I'm talking to you."
"Don't turn around," Mr. Shumway had said.
"What's wrong, Paul? It's me, Mike. Aren't you glad to see me after all this time?"
Paul wasn't hearing the words because there was no sound. Someone had hit the mute button and he couldn't hear his footsteps on the lacquer floor or his own breathing or anything. But he could distinctly remember Uncle Mike saying the words at some unspecified point in the past. He didn't look round because he'd been told not to, but Uncle Mike had gone and there was someone else.
"Hello, Paul, mate," he remembered. "Haven't you grown? Hey, what's the matter? Haven't you got anything to say to your old granddad?"
Which was cruel, because Paul had so much to say, starting with, "Sorry I missed your funeral." He'd pretended he'd had a migraine, but that had been a lie. He'd always hated funerals anyhow.
"This is daft, son. We never had a chance to say goodbye. Don't just walk away, Paul, please."
Whatever this was, Paul decided, he'd rather be somewhere else.
"This way,"
Mr. Shumway was calling, but Paul wasn't sure whether he was hearing him or remembering. The dwarf was too far away. "Don't look round," he ordered himself. "Don't say anything." Then, quite suddenly, he could see Mr. Shumway. He was kneeling down on the absence of ground, and he was reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a folded, tatty old baseball cap, opened it, reached in, and pulled out, why am I not surprised, a white rabbit. In his other hand he was holding a knife, and with a deft, quick movement, "Don't say anything," Paul commanded himself, because what he wanted to shout was "No!" at the top of his voice. Mr. Shumway cut the rabbit's throat, and its blood splashed on the empty space where the ground ought to have been and disappeared, just as Mr. Shumway had when he'd walked through the door. The rabbit stopped twitching in his hand. Blood was still gushing out over his wrist, through his fingers. Now, however, where it stopped falling, there was ground, a flat grey surface of dust, as though that was what the rabbit had had in its veins.
"It's life, see?" Mr. Shumway was muttering. "Where it lands." He hesitated. "You do know where you are, right? Don't answer," he added quickly. "In case you haven't figured, this is death."
"Fine," Paul thought.
"It's all right," Mr. Shumway went on. "It's only a magic rabbit. It never really existed. But the blood's real blood, so it does the job. Just about enough for what we've got to do."
He dropped the carcass, which vanished.
"Right. You can talk now, but only to me, and don't look round. They'll say anything to make you talk to them, and you really don't want to do that. Trust me."
Implicitly, Paul thought. He had a nasty feeling that right behind him was a substantial crowd, all people he knew, relations mostly, all of whom he'd never expected to see or hear from again. He tried to concentrate on Mr. Shumway, a tiny figure in a cheap suit standing on a minute patch of dust.
"Greetings."
The man appeared almost out of nowhere, but not quite. Actually, he shot up out of the dust, like one of those shorts they show on television occasionally when something's broken down. A film of a plant growing from a seed, speeded up thousands of times. He was Chinese, about 70 years old, in a long blue silk gown with enormous sleeves. He had a wrinkled face and a lovely smile.
"Afternoon," Mr. Shumway replied casually. "How's death treating you then?"
"Very dull," the Chinese gentleman replied. "Yourself?"
"Can't grumble, Paul," Mr. Shumway added. "Over here, this is Mr. Dow, the chief cashier. This is Paul Carpenter."
Short pause, significant.
"He's with me."
Mr. Dow nodded politely. "Of course," he said. Then Mr. Shumway turned round. His face was as white as paper.
"It's okay now," he said. "You'll be all right now. They know you. Give me the bag, and then we can get out of here."
Paul handed him the satchel. He opened it.
"These checks to pay in," Mr. Shumway said to Mr. Dow. "And these TTs. If you can get them out today, that'd be a great help."
"No problem," said Mr. Dow, with a faint smile.
"Thanks. Oh, and here's the cash slips."
Each time Mr. Shumway handed something to Mr. Dow, there was a moment between Mr. Shumway letting go of it and Mr. Dow taking it. The cheque or form or chit didn't fall to the ground. Obviously, gravity was optional here. Equally obviously, if the two of them both touched something at the same time, something unpleasant would happen. Mr. Shumway passed the bag back to Paul and nodded at the Chinese gentleman.
£17,465 sterling, said Mr. Dow.
Paul, holding the satchel open, felt a very slight tug on his hands as something he couldn't see dropped into it.
$9,041. Another tug. 18,940 Swiss francs. 72,000 Tajikistani rubles. 960 Bulgarian lev.
And so on, through Moroccan dirhams and Haitian goods to Comoros francs and Korean won, wealth beyond the nightmares of avarice. The temptation to grab the satchel and run off with it was, however, no trouble at all to keep in check.
"Right," Mr. Shumway said at last. "That's a lot. Thanks. Same time tomorrow, then?"
"Indeed." Mr. Dow bowed graciously and then glanced quickly at Paul.
"But perhaps, if you aren't in too much of a hurry, you might care to stop for a cup of tea. Your friend—"
Suddenly Paul realised that he'd never felt so thirsty in all of his life. A cup of tea, yes, he could really do with...
"No thanks," Mr. Shumway said abruptly.
"Paul," he added, as if calling a duck to heel. But, Paul said, but Mr. Dow was looking away, ever so slightly shamefaced.
"My apologies," he was saying. "It won't happen again."
Was that compassion on Mr. Shumway's face?
"It's all right," he muttered. "I understand, but we'd better go now."
"Of course," Mr. Dow said. He vanished and the patch of dust with him. Mr. Shumway breathed out slowly.
"Turn round," he said. "Gently does it. Now we're going straight back. Follow me, and no looking back or talking. Don't answer, just nod."
For some reason it seemed to take twice as long to get back as it had to get there, wherever there was. All the way, Paul kept his eyes fixed on the back of Mr. Shumway's head, as if it was the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen in his entire life. At times it seemed like they were both wading knee-deep through something heavy and sticky, toffee sauce or cake mix, and Mr. Shumway's progress gradually got slower and more laborious with every step. The memories raged in Paul's head like a snowstorm, so many of them, all of them so hurt, so disappointed, angry because he just walked on past them and wouldn't even look them in the eye. He realised that he hadn't taken a breath since they'd met Mr. Dow, but he didn't feel strange or uncomfortable. At last Mr. Shumway stopped, though Paul couldn't see anything to stop for. He was panicking about that when a tall rectangular hall appeared in the darkness, and the savage brilliance of the shaded 100-watt bulb in Mr. Shumway's office scorched him like a laser cannon.
"On balance," Mr. Shumway said,
closing the door behind them and leaning on it,
"I think I preferred it when we used to use NatWest."
He reached behind him and shot the top bolt.
"But the BOTD's long-term deposit rates are pretty much unbeatable, and their business account charges are 2% less."
He turned round, supporting himself against the door frame with his left hand, and looked up. Paul managed to get as far as the desk before his knees gave way. His eyes were full of sweat, and now suddenly he was out of breath and freezing cold. "Mr. Shumway," he said.
"Benny,"
Mr. Shumway replied without looking round.
I guess you can call me that after, he shrugged. I got to do that every day, 5 days a week. You can see why, far as I'm concerned, dragons and vampires are a pleasant change.
Benny, Paul said, that man, not the right word, but was there a right word to describe Mr. Dow? All in all, he rather hoped there wasn't. When he offered me a cup of tea, what would have happened if I'd...
Benny shook his head. Nothing you'd have enjoyed, he said. Same as if you looked round, or answered them when they talked to you.
He turned to face Paul. His eyes were very round behind their 3/8 of an inch of glass.
You've got to remember, he said, on the other side of that door there's nothing. Nothing at all. Not people or things, just, he shrugged. Well, you know, you've been there now.
He walked slowly to the desk, like a drunk trying to stay upright, and plumped onto his chair.
Look, Paul, he said, I'm sorry for not warning you, but if I had, you wouldn't have come with me. And
his shoulders sagged.
Just once in a while, it's good to know that there's something alive in there, apart from just me. It's supposed to be all right, now that they know me. I'm the accredited representative of J.W.W, and the bank people have guaranteed my safety. But,
Benny sighed, and his head went forward into his folded arms.
But they never stop trying, you know. Just little sneaky things, like the business with the tea. If they get you, you see, they get just a little bit of life. A couple of seconds, maybe, and then it's back to...
He yawned. He was exhausted too, Paul realised.
So you can't blame them, really. I mean, you'd be the same. Will be one day, of course. But it doesn't do any good thinking about that.
He raised his head.
You okay?
Of course not. Yes, Paul said. I'm fine, only...
Yes?
Only, Paul said. Do I have to do that again? I mean... Mr. Shumway looked at him.
No, he said. Like I told you, I just wanted the company. No, you don't have to go.
I don't have to go, Paul thought, and then he looked at Mr. Shumway, bloodless and empty-eyed. It's okay, Paul said. I don't mind. Just a very faint smile, because anything more would have needed more strength than Benny Shumway had just then.
Thanks, he said. Doesn't mean I'm going to be nice to you, mind, he added. You don't get your lunch hour back or anything.
Slight disappointment, because Paul was only human. For now, anyway, grateful for small mercies. Whatever it was that had been whispering in his mind's ear back there, it hadn't been human at all. I know, he said. It's all right.
Fine.
Mr. Shumway shrugged off the whole experience like someone shuffling out of a wet coat.
In that case, tomorrow we're going to make a start on intermediate nitroglycerin.
His trademark feral grin flashed for the first time since they'd gone through the door.
Just something for you to think about between now and then, he added.
That night Paul had a rather unpleasant dream. In it, Sophie had become an incredibly famous and glamorous movie star, and he'd stood in line to get her autograph for hours and days and weeks, only to find when eventually he got to the head of the queue that she'd died in her sleep, and Countess Judy de Castelbianco had taken over from her. The next time was worse. On the way to wherever it was they went to, there were even more of them. Dead aunts, uncles, cousins, relatives Paul had never even heard of, names scrawled in brown ink on the backs of curling photographs, all reproaching him bitterly for his total lack of compassion. It'd have been worse if he'd ever been under the illusion that any of his relations liked him. And when they got there, and Mr. Shumway had produced his old baseball cap, stuffed a big silk handkerchief into it, taken out 6 milk-white doves and blasted them out the air with the Remington 870 pump-action shotgun he drew out of his top pocket, now that, Paul had to admit, as a 6 pathetic white corpse spiralled out of the air, is conjuring. This time it wasn't grey, venerable Mr. Dow who sprouted up out of the bloody dust at his feet. This time it was a heartbreakingly lovely young girl who smiled at him and said that her name was Miss Wah, and could she be of any assistance? Even Benny Shumway had to take a couple of seconds to pull himself together, and when their business concluded she smiled again and asked if they'd like to stop for a cup of tea because, she explained, she hadn't had anything to drink since 1723 when she died in the arms of her husband on their wedding day. That,
Benny admitted as he slammed the door shut and leaned on it, was too bloody close.
Yes, Paul said.
Too bloody close, Benny elaborated as he turned the keys by half, maybe even 5/8. He shook his head and pocketed the keyring. I've been doing this run for 2 years now. They never tried that on me. In fact, he added, favouring Paul with a sour frown, my guess it was laid on for your benefit. They know about you, see? About all of us. They can spot your weaknesses soon as you step through that door.
Oh, Paul could feel his face going red. I'm not that bad, am I? He mumbled. Benny Shumway looked at him for a moment or so before he answered.
They know, he repeated. I guess I'm lucky, he added, because they don't have Westerners working for the bank, and my problem's always been redheads and blondes, he added after a brief pause, and brunettes. Not that I've got anything against the stunning girls from the Orient, but I never could resist a redhead.
Said Paul.
Don't you go all thoughtful, Benny said. Like I told you, they know, so it's pretty obvious where you stand on the issue. Nothing to feel bad about either, he added. I've never felt bad about it, me. If there's such a thing as reincarnation, I want to come back as a maiden-form bra, but letting them see it, that's something else. You've got to find a way of dealing with it.
Right, Paul muttered.
Me, Benny added, dropping into his chair. I always think about goblins.
Goblins? The Shumway grinned.
You've come across Dennis Tanner's mother, right?
It was Paul had to admit a valid point. I'll try that, he said. Thanks.
No charge.
Benny looked at his watch.
Well, he said, it's 5:15, and by rights you've got just enough time to help me write in these yellow slips. But, he added, pulling his wire tray towards him across the desk, I reckon I probably owe you one by now, so you piss off and I'll do it. I happen to know, he added to nobody in particular, that she rather fancies seeing the new Mel Gibson film. Odeon, Leicester Square. Programme starts 6:10, but you won't mind missing the trailers.
Maybe, Paul thought as he ran down the stairs, it's a dwarf thing, or maybe it was so bloody obvious that even dead bankers could read it in his face. That said, Benny Shumway had been right on the money. Ever since that serendipitous lunchtime, Paul hadn't had a chance to say more than a quick-clipped hello to Mel's on his way past the front desk, and that was a situation he badly wanted to set right. Mel's reckoned that it wasn't a very good film. It went on 20 minutes too long, she said, and she didn't really like FX Fests anyhow. Paul had no opinion whatsoever about the movie. He couldn't remember a thing about it, since his attention had been elsewhere. The flickering light of the screen had been bright enough to highlight the curve of her cheek and the curl of her earlobe. He'd noticed them during the last trailer, and by the time he'd managed to drag his attention away from them, there was nothing on the screen except the names of assistant cameramen. Mostly I like his films, she was saying, though the endings are usually a bit of a letdown. This one, though, I started fidgeting halfway through. He knew. He had noticed. She fidgeted divinely. Bizarrely, he hadn't been aware of how gloriously she fidgeted when he'd sat behind her at the Burnham Grove Primary, but he put that down to being a late developer, or profoundly stupid. "You're so right," he was about to say, but instead he sneezed. "Bless you," Mel said promptly. Then, "Looks like you've caught it now." Paul looked up. So she'd guessed. Only a matter of time. Sorry? "The office cold," she explained. "Been going round for a week or so. I'm lucky," she added. "I never get colds or flu, not for want of trying. At my last job I'd have given good money for a really surefire flu bug that had kept me at home for a week. Everybody else got it, not me. Life can be really unfair sometimes." He had no idea what she was talking about, but of course it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was sitting at the same table as him in the Pizza Hut in the Strand, and that she didn't seem to mind one bit. Bizarre, but he wasn't going to argue. Suited him just fine. "So," he was dimly aware of saying, "you like the pictures then?" "Love them," Mells replied promptly, apparently not noticing how fortuitous his remark had been. In fact, it's crossed my mind to see if I can put in for a transfer. You know J.W.W's got an office in Hollywood. Something crumpled inside Paul's head. Yes, he knew that very well. Somehow he'd managed to forget, just temporarily, but now she'd reminded him. So kind of her. You don't want to go there, he said, before he'd realised it. Oh? She just looked intrigued. What's the matter with it?
Earthquakes.
He tried to ignore the fact that he despised himself for being an unimaginative buffoon.
A very dangerous area because of all the seismic activity. I was reading somewhere, one of these days, a whole part of California is going to disappear down a huge crack in the ground.
Mells giggled. Most young women over 17 don't do giggles well, but she had the gift. I see, she said. Well, if I do get a transfer, I'll be sure to take a parachute. Seriously, though, is it something I should know?
Paul hesitated and then nodded. I've heard, well, a few things, he said awkwardly.
Really?
A friend of mine.
Why so much guilt? Just because of his choice of words? But he felt as though he'd just given the order for all his most cherished memories to be dragged out and shot.
A friend of mine, he repeated, got posted over there just recently. Apparently it's no fun at all. Not glamorous or anything, just plain boring.
She frowned, and then her face lit up. You could have taken a photograph down a mine shaft by the glow. Oh, yes, she said. I heard something about that. That clerk who used to work with you. Someone told me her name.
Sophie Pettingill. There, he'd done it. The ultimate betrayal. Like finally throwing away your childhood teddy bear. I got an email the other day. She says she can't wait for her 3 months to be over so she can come home.
Mells was looking at him. She didn't need to say, didn't she used to be your girlfriend? Well, she said, maybe I'll give that a miss then. I suppose 3 months is a long time to be away anyhow.
He'd done it. But in spite of that, or maybe because of it, they weren't alone at the table anymore. Next to Paul, just on the extreme edge of his vision, was a hall where Sophie wasn't, a palpable presence. It put him in mind of the patch of nothing where the blood fell, and suddenly a dead Clerk jumped up. It occurred to him that the two effects were essentially the same. Mr. Dow and Miss Wah were, what, ghosts? But a ghost just a heavy-duty memory, which can only be revived and called back with a splash of someone else's life. He thought of the memories that had mobbed him as he'd walked across the empty space with Benny Shumway. Would Sophie be with them tomorrow? No matter how good you are at multitasking, you can't really brood on guilt and death and flirt at the same time. Mel seemed very slightly disappointed when, 10 minutes later, Paul explained that he had a bit of a headache and he'd better go home now. But she replied that it was probably the cold, and she was sure he'd be better in the morning. A hot lemsip and 2 paracetamol, she suggested.
She did rather make it sound like she cared. Infuriating how something like that could be truly wonderful and an absolute disaster at the same time.
It's okay, Benny Shumway announced at 2:15 p.m. on the 11th day. I can see to the banking myself. Paul could have wept with relief, except... No, I don't mind, really, he said. I'm sort of getting used to it, he added, truthful as Bill Clinton. It's not so bad once you know what to expect. But Benny shook his head. I am not being nice, he replied, but there's a rush job come up, and one of us has got to go and see to it.
Oh,
quite. Benny pulled a face. Because if you were to ask me, do I think you're ready to be let out on your own doing heroism, the answer would have to be no. But one of us has got to do it, and one of us has got to nip out to the bank. You see what?
Paul nodded.
Actually, Benny went on, I think you can probably handle this one okay. I mean, you know all the theory and procedures and stuff, and it's only a titchy little job, I guess, he added with a total lack of sincerity. It'll be good experience for you. I mean, better to cut your teeth on something small like this, rather than get chucked in at the deep end. He was scribbling something on a blue stores requisition. You'd better take a taxi to get there, he said. Some of the stuff's quite bulky, and none of it's really the sort of gear you can take on the tube.
Paul, glancing over his shoulder, caught sight of the words 35mm anti-tank grenade and decided it was nice that there was something that he and Benny could agree on.
As it turned out, all the kit fitted quite easily into a large suitcase, and it wasn't far in any case. The job, according to the file Benny handed him, was to dispose of a small but moderately vicious wyvern that was nesting in a cash point machine at the Piccadilly Circus end of Boxford Street. So far, it confined itself to eating customers' cards, which wasn't a problem since they were used to it and therefore didn't suspect anything unusual. Inside the file, Paul found a note in Benny's handwriting. Suggest 50 millilitres Slaymore mixed 25-1 with tap water delivered by plant mister through slot, failing which use your discretion and try not to blow up any buildings. It was more helpful than some of Benny's other suggestions, but not by much. When Paul got there, he found that the bank people had already put out orange plastic cones and a yellow and white tape, better invisibility magic than anything he'd come across in the office procedures manual. He put down his suitcase, took out the dummy cash point card he'd been issued with, and very gingerly fed it into the slot. As anticipated, it went in and didn't come out again. The little whisper of blue smoke that drifted up from the slot afterwards was so slight that he wouldn't have noticed it if he hadn't been looking for it. Unfortunately, although he'd brought the plant mister and a bottle of Evian, he'd forgotten the Slaymore. The thought of going back to the office and explaining didn't appeal to him, nor, rather to his surprise, did the idea of taking a life. True, killing a fellow life form wasn't something he'd ever choose to do, but in his list of priorities, getting the job done without making a total bog of it would normally have towered over mercy like an overgrown Alp. Possibly, it was all those trips to the bank, seeing at first hand what it was like on the other side of the final curtain. Anyhow, he didn't want to do it, and maybe there was another way. He'd read through enough broadsheet newspapers to know that violence is always the problem, never the solution, and that a sword is a piece of steel with a victim at either end. The way of peace, however, will always prevail if only enemies can be made to talk to each other, which would be fine if he could speak Wyvern. Communication. That was the key. All Paul had to do was figure out how to get through to the little scaly horror, and everything would be peachy. Communication. Communication begins with information, and information is about the only thing the 21st century is good at. In his wallet, Paul had a whole deck of little plastic rectangles which held, in digital form, every single bit of information about him in the whole world. He pulled them out. Visa card, social security card, video library card, mobile top-up card, Boots bonus point card, a tarot pack containing his entire past, present and future, and began stuffing them into the slot, one after another. Puffs of smoke came out like a really bad day at the Vatican. As the last one vanished into the black hole, he stood back and waited. Inevitably, the Wyvern would by now have a complete picture of Paul Carpenter, his station in life, his obligations, resources, passions, habits. From these, the canny creature would realise that Paul wasn't its enemy, just a friend it hadn't met yet. It would come out, they'd exchange expressions of mutual respect in sign language, and nobody would have to die or get their fingers bitten. He waited. Nothing happened. Then, just as Paul was starting to wonder what had gone wrong, the slot burped at him. Cheered, he thought. He spent the next 10 minutes trying to fish around inside the slot with a plastic ruler, until that got eaten too. He tried kneeling beside the machine and singing into it. Music is a purer form of communication than words. Whales sing to each other, and you never read about mugged whales. Then he tried pleading and threats. Come along, Paul urged himself. This is pathetic. What would Jean-Luc Picard do? But it occurred to him that every time Jean-Luc found himself at the mercy of an unseen superintelligent adversary, it turned out to be a lost, frightened little orphan who really only wanted to go home. Suddenly, the idea of a stiff jolt of Slaymore made a lot of sense. Unfortunately, he had no cash for a ride back to the office, and the bloody machine had swallowed his card. What would Benny do? Well, Paul knew the answer to that. It was on the little bit of paper he'd so recklessly ignored. What would Mr. Wormtorter do? Or Mr. Tanner? Or Professor Van Spee? He considered these questions for a while, and then realised he was asking the wrong questions. The right question, of course, was what would Paul Carpenter do? Assuming Paul Carpenter's IQ was at least double his shoe size. Having problems? Said a voice to his left. He jumped up,
He'd been crouching on the ground so that he could whisper into the slot without having to crick his neck, and looked round to see who'd spoken. There was a beautiful girl standing next to him, tall, willowy, natural redhead, lovely smile that almost managed to conceal the fact that it was only just evolved from a rather distinctive grin. "You," Paul growled. Then he remembered. I thought you were off on maternity leave or something." "I am," the flame-haired beauty replied. "Been for my check-up. Harley Street, just over there." She waved a hand in some direction or another. "Only goblin gynecologist in Western Europe." "Right," Paul said. "And I suppose that skin you're wearing is just some old thing you found at the back of the wardrobe?" "I like to look nice," Mr. Tanner's mum replied. "What's wrong with that? I mean, which would you rather look at, this or a 6 months pregnant goblin?" Paul shrugged. "Anyhow," he said, "the answer to your question is yes." Mr. Tanner's mum took a step towards the bank machine and sniffed. "Let me guess," she said. "Wyvern, right? And you've been feeding it plastic?" Paul nodded. "That's a mistake, isn't it?" She smiled. "Afraid so," she said. "Only 2 ways to shift wyverns, short of high explosives. Gas 'em or starve 'em. Me, I'd have gone for 50 mil of Slaymore mixed 25 to 1. "Yes, I know," Paul replied. "But I haven't got any bloody Slaymore, have I? I can't go back to the office to get any because—" "Right." She was not sniggering. "In that case, you're left with plan C." "Plan what?" She twitched her nose at him. "Probably a goblin thing. Best summed up in the words of the late Richard Nixon. When you've got 'em by the balls, their hearts and minds will follow. Lucky it's a doe and not a buck." "Is it? How'd you know that?" replied Mr. Tanner's mum. "Who hasn't done his reading assignments then? Page 774 of the Office Procedures Manual. It's wyvern breeding season, as you ought to know, but obviously don't. What you've got there is a broody young doe, probably got 6 eggs. Chris' new Bank of England tenors are their preferred nest material." "Oh," Paul replied, and for some reason he blushed. Mr. Tanner's mum had the knack of making anything remotely concerned with the procreation sound totally obscene. "How does that help?" he added. She gave him a pitying look. "Shut up and keep perfectly still," she said. "At this point, I'd usually say it won't hurt a bit, but I read somewhere that lying makes you fat." She snapped her fingers, and Paul managed to keep from a forced landing on the hard pavement by flapping his wings. That was fine, except that it made him think, wings? What wings? And that interfered with the instinct that was keeping him airborne. He tried to remedy that by flapping harder, but all that achieved was to zoom him fast and headfirst into the wall. That hurt. Also, it hadn't done anything to solve his gravity problems, which were starting to get urgent again. He flapped wildly, but all he was managing to do was hanging in the air like the cat in the cartoons when it's just run off the edge of a cliff. "Help!" he tried to shout, but all that came out was a terrified kitten-like mewing. Then, as if that wasn't enough to contend with, a monster came rushing at him, a vulture-beaked, leather-winged, feathered dragon, swooping through the air with its talons flexed and its claws out, which grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and lifted him into the air, yelling, "How many times have I told you you're not to play outside without asking first?" in some sort of speech that didn't need words. The expression maternal instinct had just formed inside his mind when a Himalaya-sized Mr. Tanner's mum swatted the monster with a rolled-up newspaper, volleying both of them to the ground in a confused and painful heap. "Ow!" Paul yelled, and realised he'd yelled in English. Also, he was sitting on the monster, which had suddenly shrunk down to the size of a small King Charles Spaniel. "Get up, you're squishing it," commanded Mr. Tanner's mum, pulling him out of the way and placing her stilettoed heel firmly on the wyvern's neck. She had shrunk too, which was something. "There's one thing I can't be doing with, it's cruelty to animals." Paul flopped against the wall. "What did you do to me?" he gasped. "Turned you into baby wyvern, of course," Mr. Tanner's mum replied calmly. "It's a well-known fact. Mummy wyverns in the nesting season can't tell their own offspring from strangers. So as soon as it heard a baby in distress, it was out of there like a ferret up a Yorkshireman's trousers." She beamed at him. "Job done. Mind, it'll be a bit pissy when it wakes up, so if I was you, I'd kill it now." Paul scowled at her. "No," he said. "Absolutely not. You can't go round killing things just because they're inconvenient." The wyvern woke up and bit him in the leg.
After that, things got a bit confused, what with Paul trying to stamp on the wyvern's head with a foot he'd have been better off using to stand on. It was probably falling on it that made it let go of his leg, though Mr. Tanner's mum insisted that she'd felled it with a well-aimed kick from her steel-toe-cap Roland Cartier's. By the time he'd staggered to his feet again, everything had gone quiet. "See," said Mr. Tanner's mum. "You changed your tune pretty quick." But... Paul hadn't bothered looking at the wyvern to see if it was all right, but it didn't matter, because one glance at it told him there wasn't any rush. "Poor little cow," Mr. Tanner's mum said. "Still, that's a pest control game for you." Paul waited to see if it moved, but it didn't. "It's dead," he said. "Isn't it?" "Course it's dead," Mr. Tanner's mum said. "You were sitting on its windpipe for about half a minute. They may be fierce little bastards, but they're fragile. It's like I always say, in 7 cases out of 10, the balm is mightier than the sword." Paul's knees had gone wobbly, and it probably wasn't due to the pain from his savaged ankle. "I killed it," he said. "I wasn't going to do that." Mr. Tanner's mum grinned at him. "Drat," she said. "Still, there you go, omelettes and eggs. Talking of which," she added quickly, "you better get a wriggle on if you want to nip inside and make them open up the vault." "Why would I want to do that?" "The eggs, stupid. Wyvern's eggs. They're solid gold with a diamond shell, worth an absolute bomb. You don't want some light-fingered cashier getting to them before you do." "No." The authority in Paul's voice surprised him. "I've just killed the poor thing. I'm not going to steal its eggs too. Maybe if they're left alone they'll hatch." "You bet they will," said Mr. Tanner's mum. "And then there'll be 5 wyverns in this cash machine instead of just 1. She hesitated. "Actually," she said, "that's not a bad idea, because then we'll get called in to get rid of them. 5 wyverns at £1 a time. Our Dennis would love that." Paul sighed. "What we'll do," he said coldly, "is rescue the eggs and take them somewhere remote where they can hatch out in safety. Maybe we could call the RSPCA. What's so funny?" Mr. Tanner's mum's grin had a very faint soppy look to it. "You," she said. "Crazy as a barrel full of ferrets, but funny with it. They're wyverns, Dumbo. Soon they're old enough to walk, they'll head straight for the nearest accumulation of wealth and start making nuisances of themselves. They're small and fragile, but they can kill, and they do. Really," she added, shaking her head. "Even for a human, you're weird. What else do you want us to do? Knit little jackets for orphan vampire bats? Put out a saucer of milk for stray cholera bacilli?" There didn't seem any point arguing with her. Besides, Paul's attitude seemed to be having the ghastly side effect of making her feel fond of him, something he wanted to avoid at all costs. Tough on the baby wyverns, of course, but their mum had just eaten all of his personal plastic. "Fine," he said. "We'll go and get the eggs. What'll happen to them?" Mr. Tanner's mum looked sad. "They belong to the bank," she said, "so they get the money, but we get 10%, which will please our Dennis. Oh," she added, "we could keep them, 2 for you, 3 for me. We'll be rich, very rich." Paul's turned to hesitate. If the baby wyverns were doomed anyway, and the blood money was going to go to J.W. in the bank, if he was rich, there were all sorts of things, but where would be the point in that? He was still bound to J.W. by the terms of his contract. Money wouldn't change that. And there was also a small matter of having to live with himself. "I don't want them," he said. "You can have them if you like." Mr. Tanner's mum stared at him. "Bloody hell," she said. "Why?" Paul shrugged. He wasn't sure himself. "Better you than the bank, I suppose. Anyway, it was you who got rid of the wyvern, so I guess..." He'd run out of things to say. "Thanks," Mr. Tanner's mum said quietly. "Nobody's ever given me anything like that before. Not that I need the money, mind," she added, "but it's the thought that counts." It occurred to Paul that he'd probably just done a very stupid thing. That doesn't mean," he said quickly. "I know." The very lovely girl who Mr. Tanner's mum was being at that moment smiled at him, and there was no trace of a grin. "That's what makes it, well, unusual, because you don't fancy me rotten. Anyway," she said, suddenly brisk, "let's get the eggs and get out of here." 20 minutes later, they had the eggs. They were heavy, but small enough to fit in the suitcase that Paul had brought along to hold his dragon-slaying gear. They wrapped up the dead wyvern in a black dustbin liner they'd begged from the bank staff. Mr. Tanner's mum hoisted it up onto her shoulder, saying she had a use for it. Paul didn't want to know what that might be. Well," he said awkwardly, "thanks, I'd better be getting back." "You're trying to get rid of me," Mr. Tanner's mum replied, accurately, "but I've got cash for a cab fare and you haven't." Paul smiled weakly. "That's all right then," he said.
Mr. Tanner's mum had no trouble finding a taxi. She raised her arm, and there one was. If it was magic, it was probably the simple, bitterly unfair kind that looks after pretty young women and leaves gormless-looking young men to fend for themselves. As they walked into reception together, Mr. Tanner's mum was holding Paul's arm, and he was too preoccupied to make her stop. Mels looked up from whatever she'd been doing and stared at them. Correction, she stared at Paul and scowled at Mr. Tanner's mum. It took Paul a moment to figure out that Mels wouldn't know who the lovely young female beside him really was. Gosh, he thought. Then Mels looked away, her body language explaining to Paul that he didn't exist. He felt a powerful urge to explain. It's not what you think, really. She's this incredibly ugly goblin. Go on, turn back into a goblin so Mels can see. But resisted it manfully and pressed on towards the fire door. He wasn't looking, but had an idea that Mr. Tanner's mum was smirking. Don't know what you see in her anyway, she said, as they climbed the first lot of stairs. Mind you, she's an improvement on that bony little cow who dumped you. Still, you want to make sure you keep her away from the cream cakes and the chocky bickies. Shut up, Paul replied. Please. Whatever. As Paul had hoped, the closed file store was deserted. He shut the door, opened the suitcase, and handed over the wyvern's eggs. They were still, he realised guiltily, quite warm. You sure about this? Mr. Tanner's mum asked, as he held out the first pair to her. If you've changed your mind. No, really. Mostly he just wanted rid of them. You have them, just get them out of my sight. All right. Mercifully, she took them and loaded them into a cardboard box she'd found on the floor. Now you bugger off, she said. I may see you later. Paul fled. First, he checked to see if Benny was back yet from doing the banking, but his office was empty and the small door was ajar. Paul made a special point of not looking through it. Instead, he went back to his own office and looked up Wyvern in the Office Procedures Manual's index. There were lots of references, mostly to do with statutory limitations on when, where, and with what they could be killed. In fact, he'd broken at least 6 laws that afternoon, not that he cared too much about that. Nowhere in the legislation did it say, "Thou shalt not kill wyverns." The message that came across was more along the lines of, "Thou shalt not kill wyverns the easy way," which wasn't the same thing at all. Paul was just checking out the commentary on section 665.4.2 of the Small Dragons Exterminations Regulations 1997. Wyverns may not be shot with a mechanical crossbow exceeding 9 feet in width on Sundays between the 15th of June and the 3rd of November, except in Scotland, the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. When the door opened. This time, Mr. Tanner's mum had reverted to her goblin shape. On balance, Paul decided, trying not to stare at the finger-long tusks, the chin bristles, the little dribble of slather. He preferred it that way, less intimidating. "Got something for you," she said. She opened her hand and something fell onto the desk in front of him. A single red gemstone about the size of a tiny nugget of coal. "Thank you," he said automatically. What is it?" Grin. "You don't want to know." "Tell me anyway." She shrugged. "It's a wyvern's third eye." Paul winced while managing to keep perfectly still. It was a knack that he'd acquired since he'd been working for J.W. It was a right bitch getting it out. Broke 2 screwdrivers. Fine, Paul said. What's it do? Bigger grin. Pick it up. Paul hesitated. Clearly Mr. Tanner's mum thought he'd be too squeamish. Not so wide of the mark at that, but he picked it up anyway. Well? Very good. Now look at it. He looked at it, focusing on the sharp, straight facet lines. I'm looking at it, he said. It's a small red stone. Big deal. Something turned off his speech at the mains. It was like staring at a very small television through a dusty keyhole. But he could see a desk, and behind it, in case you haven't guessed, Mr. Tanner's mum said, show you stuff you can't normally see. If you practice, you can learn to see useful things. Otherwise, it just shows you your own true love. So it's a bit wasted on you. I mean, who needs a fantastically rare stone when all you've got to do is nip downstairs to reception? Still, it's traditional. Your first dragon. Wyverns count as dragons, you see. Just about. You get to keep its eye. She clicked her tongue. Paul was still gazing into the stone, as if nothing else existed. Well, she said, I'll leave you to it then. Really, if I'd known you had this sort of thing about fat women... At some point, she must have stopped talking and gone away, because when Paul finally managed to look up, she'd gone. He blinked a couple of times and then looked back at the storm, just to make sure, and saw a thin, dark young woman with large eyes. She was picking her nose with the cap of a bye-roll, and behind her head, through a window, Paul could just make out a hillside with big white letters on it. Funny how when you're fairly sure that at least one segment of your horrendously complicated life has finally fallen into place, even though everything else is still screwed up beyond any remote possibility of redemption, something will come along and twist everything through 95 degrees. His own true love, apparently. Sophie.